People always ask me where I get my interview subjects from, and I always tell them sometimes publicists reach out to me, and sometimes it's just some interesting story I see out there, whether it's on TV or read about in the news. And for you, I came across your column recently in the Washington Post about your life, your career, and your family. So, and that's a big part of your story. So I kind of just want to start first at the beginning, and we'll try to touch on everything about where you grew up and about your family and all of that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you found me. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, like 30-ish miles west of New York, and my whole family, for the most part, is still there. My dad, who I wrote about in that column, and I'm sure we'll talk about more, was the youngest of 10 siblings. So I grew up in a big Italian American Catholic family with lots of cousins, lots of aunts and uncles. And I was there until I went to college in California. And then I have bounced around a little bit since then. And now I've landed back closest to my roots that I have been in about a decade. I'm in Brooklyn, New York now.
Okay, and let's talk about your parents. Where did they meet, and what did they do for work, and all of that?
Yeah, my parents, they actually met in high school. They went to the same high school. Legend has it that my dad had a crush on my mom in high school and was a year younger than her, but they were just friends at the time. And then they met again when they were out of college and they were in the same management program in Manhattan. They both worked in the fashion industry for a little bit, and then my dad started working for his family's business, which is a small manufacturing company in New Jersey that make moisture meters. It is exactly what they sound like. It's like if your house floods, this is one of the products that the industrial people come in and check how bad the damage is. So it was very niche, and I along with like my brother, my cousin, everyone kind of like works there at some point. But my dad was the vice president of sales there. My mom was a stay-at-home mom when my brother and I were growing up, and then she started working in retail and operations when we were a little bit older. And they were together until I was 15, and just after my freshman year of high school, my parents separated and divorced because my dad came out as gay.
And at 16, when he came out as gay, talk about that and how it affected you and your relationship, and how did your life change at that point? I mean, was there any like kind of inclination before that that he might have been, or anything like that?
I think like looking back, yes, and a lot of things are kind of stereotypical. It could be not necessarily that he was gay, but he was very, into fashion, not into sports, more feminine in that sense. But yeah, it wasn't that long ago, but long ago enough that gay people and gay culture were just so not a part of my life. I think especially in kind of like suburbs of New Jersey in the early 2000s and 2010s. Like it was 20 maybe 11 when he came out. But like I didn't know a gay person until I found out that my dad was actually gay. So that was the kind of the shock of it. It was just so not something that I was familiar with. And then he was really present as a father throughout my life, but especially after he came out and my parents separated. They lived very close to each other within like 5 minutes. My brother and I split our time equally between them. And, I think there was something, it was difficult in certain ways and also really cool and special and beautiful that as I was a teenager, figuring out a lot of things about myself and my life, my dad, I think in some ways was going through like a second adolescence, just in terms of figuring out who he was as an out gay man. So as I was in high school and living with him half the time and my mom half the time, I got to know him much more as just a person and not a parent who you see as like a disciplinarian, or they can do no wrong, or whatever the case may be. He was very open to begin with, as a person, but I think we kind of got to do a lot of learning and growing together. And divorce is always hard. Like, I think that's also part of it. Both my parents were like, yeah, we made some mistakes along the way. But I don't think that him being gay was the hardest part of any of that. It was just a factor, and then contributed to this special experience of him learning about himself and being open to change. And that was really important for me, because before that I'd grown up in a way where I had a really specific vision of kind of like how life is supposed to be and what family looks like and what doing things properly looks like, and then that's kind of out the window, which was a great
and
thing.
it sounds like nothing changed. I mean, he's still your father and you're his daughter.
Right.
So were your friends and family, were they very accepting of it? Were they like, hey, it's fine, we support you and love you no matter what? And it sounds like you've had a good relationship with both your parents, and they didn't want anything to change, like you and your brother, even at that point.
Yes, they were really good about trying to put my brother and I first. And yeah, for the most part, people were very supportive. I think it was still, a lot of it kind of came as like a quiet support of, no one was cutting my dad off or shutting him or something, but it was a little like, okay, let's just not make it too like loud and proud. Even though I think everyone in his community knew. But I think about that a lot now as an adult, how difficult that must have been, of like him coming out in the town. Really, we lived adjacent to the town he grew up in, so it was like so many people who had known him his whole life, and a small community, versus like, and now I'm moving to like New York or some big city where no one knows me and I can kind of start fresh. So yeah, there wasn't like active, animosity, but a little bit more kind of like, it's still a subdued thing that isn't so
Yeah.
out in
I
the
mean, was
open, I
there
guess.
anxiety though, like once you found out, like going to school for the first time after he kind of came out, and what friends may say?
Yeah, my approach to that was just like avoid the anxiety by telling everyone I was close to pretty much right away, being very open about it and like overly um, communicative. I was very protective of him and our family, so it was like I definitely felt it almost as a challenge of like, okay, I'm telling you this, like, are you gonna have a problem with it? And was very expressive about that fact. I think my brother took a different approach, and it wasn't that he didn't tell people or he was like it was a secret. He just was much more reserved about
Yeah. No.
broadcasting. My strategy was like, I'll avoid a problem by being overly open about it, and I think my brother was like, I'll just keep
Right.
it
Right.
more quiet, and then when it
Yeah.
comes
No. I
up,
mean, that
it'll
makes
come up.
sense. I have a nephew that's transgender, and so my sister has twins, so so his sister is very protective of him, and my sister and her ex husband, they're very accepting of him. And I think for me, like, it's not something I go out and like publicly talk about, but certainly, I have no shame in saying that, yeah, my nephew's transgender, and talking about it, I feel very comfortable with it. Um, but you're right. So I could see your brother's point, and the way he approached it is kind of the same
Right.
way I think I do. And then, so you had your father, so you had a close relationship with him even after you went to college, right, in California? And you would,
Yes, I did.
from everything I've read about you, so you guys would talk regularly on the phone. He called you a lot, and he would write you letters a lot too, around specific holidays and events and that sort of thing. Do you ever regret that you did go to college so far away, or wish that you had stayed closer, or anything like that?
No, I think that going to college where I did was really transformative and just gave me such a great perspective on like a different way of life, different types of people, grew up in certain ways, just even like logistically navigating the fact that I was flying across the country by myself every time I was going home versus taking a bus or a train. But I was really, really grateful for that. And my parents were really supportive. My mom was immediately, like, her first reaction was just kind of shock and sadness that I would actually be going that far. I remember her saying at one point, okay, like, you can't go as far as California unless it's somewhere like as good as Stanford. And then I actually got into Stanford, and I think she was like, oh no, I wish I hadn't said that. It's like, well, okay, you set the bar. And
so
here
she was
we
cool
are.
with it at that point. She was like, yeah, go.
But no, I was, yeah, she's like, oh, okay, for Stanford, it's fine. And I got to see, like, I went home for most holidays. My family visited, and my dad he traveled a lot for work for his, like, trade shows and stuff like that. And there was an annual one. I forget if it was in California or Vegas, but west enough that then he would just turn it into like a trip to visit me every year too. So we always had some like one-on-one time in California during the years that I was there, which was really fun too.
Okay. And then, so at 16, he comes out as gay, and you're living this life. Is your dad gay? And then 8 years later, he would end up taking his own life. How much of a shock was that to you?
Yes.
And, just talk about that feeling, like when you found out, and that whole experience.
Yeah, it was a huge shock. And he had struggled with depression throughout his life. There was a time when I was a child that he was very ill with depression and in and out of hospitals. So I had an awareness of that, and he was open about going to therapy and medication and very supportive of, like, even me and my brother, but even friends, of like trying to make it normal that like sometimes mental health is hard and you can get help. So in this, and right before he died, he had been struggling for a few months where his medications, like, he was kind of destabilized for a bit. So in that sense, like, on paper, it was not that shocking. It was kind of like, this was a possibility. But when you're living it, it was like, it seemed so inconceivable, even when I knew he had checked himself into the hospital. I knew I was visiting him and driving him back and forth to inpatient or outpatient group therapy programs. So he was struggling, but I think when you like love someone, you just can't, at least for me at the time, I couldn't conceive of it as an actual possibility. And then, so when I found out, it was shocking. And I had seen him just before he died. I was visiting him, and I think another part of it that made it so shocking was the fact that he was open and that he was doing so much to try to help himself, and doing kind of like checking all the boxes of, he'd done everything from gone to the psych hospital, to had a sun lamp at home, to doing meditation in the afternoon. So when I was with him, I was like, oh, I mean, how can this go wrong when you're like doing all the things that you're supposed to do? And that's an unfortunate reality of suicide. And really, I mean, so many illnesses too, where like there is no formula where you can get the interventions, and that doesn't mean that like the disease won't get you, but it's harder to conceptualize that when it is suicide. So yeah, I had been with him for about a week in New Jersey, and I was living in New Orleans at the time. I flew back to New Orleans, I think on a Friday night, like saw him that Friday, and then like 48 hours later on Sunday, my mom called me to tell me. And Sunday throughout the day, it was starting to be like I hadn't heard from him, and then a few of his friends and my aunt and a few people were kind of reaching out. And you could, everyone was trying to be like calm, but just asking like, hey, have you heard from him? Has anyone heard from him? And then by 7 or 8 p.m. we started to realize no one's heard from him. But just I was so in like, there's no way that this could be happening. And then my mom called me, and I just completely went into like shock survival mode and repacked my suitcase and flew right back to New Jersey the next day.
And you were, during his time, you were close to the LGBTQ community through him, right?
In some ways, he had, he had made a lot of friends, like, over kind of those 8 years. And it's even through, like, a lot of his dating experience turned into just, like, friendships of people who I then got to know. And often he connected with men who were in similar situations to him, like had come out later in life and had kids. So I kind of was connected to this network of his community. But then after he died, I learned like how much bigger that really was. Like I had a lot of people reaching out to me who I hadn't met, but who had known him, dated him, or were just part of like part of the community, like friends who were LGBTQ plus. And that was really special too, especially because so many of them were in that similar situation of like that trajectory where coming out later in life and coming to terms with it. And then sort of another side of that coin was I knew of a good number of folks who he was friends with and supportive of on their own journeys who were not out yet. And that felt very weighty of like with his death. And I just knew of these people's secrets, but also just, it's their own journey and battle of coming out. So I kind of had this little bit like one step away viewpoint on how prevalent and hard it is for people, and in particular like the kind of standard where men who had grown up in families or communities or cultures or time period where it was just not acceptable, and then they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s trying to figure out like, what do I do? How do I live? What do I say? What do I not say? And just made me really, really grateful that my dad had come out and I got to know him, kind of that version of him, and see how sad and damaging it is for those who aren't able to do that for whatever reasons.
But it sounds like also that, they felt comfortable reaching out to you and messaging you and talking about your father and, the impact that he had on them and their lives. He touched a lot of people.
Yeah, that was really special.
And then you gave his eulogy. Is that something that you wanted to do, or do you feel like you had to do it? Obviously, you're a great writer. So how did that come about, wanting to do that?
I really wanted to do it. I felt like, I guess in some ways I felt like I had to. It felt like a thing, like this is not a question really. Like, of course, I'll do the eulogy or will do the eulogy. My brother and I did it together, and we wrote it and alternated. I said a paragraph, he said a paragraph. And that was really important to me. I think for many reasons of like how much I loved my dad and wanted to set a tone of responding to his death with love and pride in him, and focus, not ignoring the like suicide and trauma and all of those things, but making space for all of that to be present, and just like setting the tone through the eulogy and the obituary that we're like not going to be secretive about this. We're acknowledging that like this is what happened, and that doesn't take away from who he was on top as well. Like, it doesn't define him. And I think part of it too was like a feeling of needing or wanting to prove to myself that I could like step up in tragedy and be, I think that's the person that I wanted to be. Of like, this is, you know, I was 23, basically worst case scenario situation for me of one of my, like my brother, my mom, or my dad dying. And it was important to me to feel like, okay, I've never been faced with this level of crisis or tragedy. Like, who do I want to be, or who can I show myself that I am? And writing the eulogy and kind of having the wherewithal to do that was just an important thing to me for myself. Thank you.
So after his funeral, you were trying to find purpose in life. You were going to become an investigator of death row inmates. Is that correct, in Nashville? And that's kind of like what your Washington Post column touches upon. Is that part of your career?
Yes.
So what did that like entail, and why that? You know, how did you arrive to that?
Yes. So when my dad died, I was living in New Orleans, interning as a investigative intern at a basically like a public defense office that was working with people on death row. And I wanted to do that full time, but I was just out of school and kind of getting my feet wet. And I had a very long time interest. Interest is a weird word to say for the death penalty, but when I was young, I saw a trailer for a TV show where the character was about to be executed in an electric chair, and I was really, really disturbed, like had a panic attack. And I think it just hit me that this is a thing that exists, and it's not just this like historical mythological thing. You know, I grew up Catholic. I saw Jesus on the cross all the time. I knew the executions were a thing.
Same here, yeah.
So, but the reality of like, oh, right now in America, like in this moment, it just really hit me for some reason. And years later, I came to put together that when I had that strong reaction was right around the same time that my dad was hospitalized the first time after a suicide attempt when I was young. And I think there was just a lot of like uncertainty and emotions and confusion in my life. I was like 11. So I kind of got obsessed with it in the sense that I just was like, I'm so disturbed that this exists. And I'd never understood the logic of killing someone who kills someone else, because to me it seemed very self-explanatory that like if someone kills another person, there's something wrong with them or something happened to them. So like, why are we going to kill them back?
Right. I think it goes beyond just, you know, the act of killing. I think people in a right state of mind, they're like, well, why did that person kill that person? Well, they're not mentally stable. Obviously, right. They don't think like you. Their brain's not wired like you. So it's hard to understand that. No, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. And even if it's in that like 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 2 minutes, like it's not a rational thing to do. And that's a very strange contrast to the fact that we execute people, which is extremely like clinical and procedural, and not, it's the opposite of like an act of passion or an act of mental instability. It's a state sanctioned, there's, you know, a 40-page, 75-page protocol on how to kill someone. So it's just very jarring. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with that interest. It was just something I kind of like then followed in the news for a long time, expanded to a broader interest in prisons and criminal justice, and did a lot of volunteering and interning in college as I was studying psychology. And then kind of as my capstone when I graduated, my thesis was about neuroscience and psychology of people who are 18 to 25 who are in the justice system. And then there was a day in school in my senior year when I walked out of a class and I opened my phone and I had like 6 of the same email forwarded to me from the senior listserv job board thing. It was basically this job posting for a mitigation investigator in San Francisco, which is when someone investigates kind of the life story of someone on death row as they're going through their appeals. It's less about, you know, the DNA and are they innocent or guilty. It's more about what did they go through, what kind of brain injury do they have, or parts of the story that are not told. Intellectual disability is a big one. Anyway, all these different friends sent it to me and said, I think this is your dream job. And I was like, yeah, I think this is.
It was a time too, getting 6 emails all together.
Right. Yeah. I had thought that I had planned to eventually go to law school and be a defense attorney, but I really wanted to be actually doing the work first and get a real experience before going to law school. So long story short, I'm in this internship in New Orleans. My dad dies. I'm kind of like, I either can go really like all in on this plan that I had, or I can totally pivot and be like, well, this is a life-changing event. Maybe I should change something. But I went with the first option and was like, I think part of my mindset was like, so much has changed. I need to stick to what I thought my path was. And also that I was like, I need to feel like I'm doing something good and something that is meaningful and something that is important and like serious in the wake of something so serious. So a few days after his funeral, I was sitting at my aunt and uncle's kitchen table and sent in an application to a similar position full-time in Nashville, and I ended up getting that job and moved to Nashville. How many months was that? Maybe 4 months after my dad's death to start this new job. So it was a lot of change in a short amount of time.
And any particular cases that had an impact on you?
Yeah, they all did in different ways. It's hard to say. I think one of the things that I was most surprised by as I worked with clients is you might go in assuming that it's pretty cut and dry. If you're on death row, you want to do anything possible to get off death row, which, yes, but it's not like the system is designed in such a way that whole process is also very intense and emotional. And these men who I was working with, they're not just inmates on death row who need to get off death row. They're also fathers and brothers and uncles and sons. And a lot of them did maintain relationships with their families and friends from prison, which is really, really hard to do. Not everyone is able to. Not everyone has that support. But their perspective was their sense of self was a lot more holistic or complex than I expected, which was total like naivete on my part. But it wasn't just like, oh, we have tunnel vision on the only thing I must do is get off death row. It's like, I want to go about my case in a way that is also protecting my family or protecting my daughter, who might then like have to testify in a new trial. And so it was just much more complicated and human. I mean, I expected and was going in for the humanity of like trying to bring more humanity to the clients and their stories, but kind of the challenges that I was seeing really stood out to me as like, there is actually often not an easy answer of even how to go about this in what you might think is an obvious approach of like, well, this is your best shot, so we're going to go about that. But you have to think about what is the collateral consequences for people as a whole.
Yeah, and I think you talk about this in perhaps your column about how death row inmates, their story, the pain they feel, that they don't necessarily want it to get out. Like if they're executed, then oh well, the kind of the pain they're feeling will go away. Like maybe that's an answer for it. And you touched a little bit upon, maybe this wasn't in the column, about your father and having been abused. And do you think there was some sort of like connection to the fact that, because people that I've known that have taken their own lives, it was almost like to their siblings, it wasn't a shock because they felt so much pain. Like this was their way of just relief. Like that'll make the pain go away. And yeah, was there like a connection to that like you felt as you investigated these cases and these people's lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I've written in other pieces about how it's really difficult because there's almost no mental health resources available for people on death row. So if they're talking about deeply traumatic things they've been through, it's kind of just like, well, good luck, and now we're going to put this in court, and there's no support clinically or social, like in any regard. And that's just like a really destabilizing thing that I had even more empathy for it because of my dad and because I knew about the fact that he was abused. When he told me, I was a teenager, and he said it so briefly and so like matter of factly, I could tell he was like, it was like almost out of body. Like, I just have to say this in the briefest way possible. And then after he died was when I started to learn much more about like the details of what happened and understand like I could see on his face when he told me it had happened, how painful that was just to say I was molested when I was 12, like a sentence that brief, let alone more detail and context to that. And so I absolutely do see the connection, not just between that and his death. And I was seeing a lot of parallels in my work, working with people on death row who were in similar, whether it was sexual abuse, physical abuse, lots of traumatic grief, like so many things that they had gone through. It was like you could see physically how it's like, I cannot open this can of worms because keeping that lid like sealed shut is the only thing that's kind of keeping me together and keeping me okay. And it made me rethink a lot of my ideas about, I think, control and agency. And I understand why, when you go through something so traumatic, the things you feel you have control over might shift a lot. And part of that, I think, when for some people who are suicidal or die by suicide, is that that's something that they can control in a way of living where they don't feel like they have control or had control over something that happened to them. And though I didn't personally go through that kind of trauma or abuse, the trauma of my dad's death was really severe for me for a couple of years. And I think I was kind of reflecting that in a different way of like, I was started to get obsessed with like, my thing that I wanted to control was working on my cases and just being like, if I just do just the right thing, I will get this investigation perfect and I will stop them from being killed. And the reality is I could have done the best investigations in the world, and there's so many factors outside of your control. You just get a judge, whoever who just doesn't even look at what you did. But yeah, in terms of kind of that mindset, I felt like I gained a lot of empathy for how hard that is.
Did that weigh on you a lot though too? I mean, in that job, in that position? You just mentioned for all those reasons, that if you investigate the case perfectly, that you kind of put the weight on yourself to help these people in front of a judge or what have you, when really, it's out of your control. I mean, you can only do so much that you can do, but a lot of it's out of your control. And did that add pressure to you when you were already probably in a very emotionally sad state, or I don't know how to best to describe it, after your father's death?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a lot of my supervisor and um, other attorneys who I worked for tried to really set a tone, like set that expectation of how difficult this is and how much you have to redefine what you consider a win, and that we're not going to save everyone. We might not be able to save anyone. Like, you even using language of like saving is really hard, because that's just not the healthiest thing, and often not really possible. But I had one attorney I worked with liken it to sometimes being like working on hospice care, where really you're like, the outcome is pretty much known, probably known, but we're going to try to extend life and improve quality of life for as long as possible. And those things, I heard them, I struggled, like they didn't stick in my brain, because I think at the time I wasn't aware of this consciously until, again, like years later, and I've done writing and lots of reflection on it. But I think my mindset was like, this is I didn't save my dad. I didn't do enough. I didn't like know enough. So, but now here's my opportunity to like make up for that, because I will make sure I know enough. I will make sure I like do all the things I'm supposed to. And the reality is, even if I did, that doesn't guarantee anything. And also, like, there was no way I was ever going to like do things perfectly or find every, turn over every stone. It's just not realistic. But they were so close together and so related to me in my mind, and I was in such a like shocked and griefy state, I couldn't really separate the two for myself.
Yeah, sure. And you would eventually leave that job because you said that you concluded that the feeling your emotions was enough to find meaning, and that rather than needing to act on them through that career. How did that realization affect your outlook and then your life and your work after that, post that career?
Yeah, so I left that career, still kind of toying with the idea of going to law school, but I gave myself some time, like truly off, which I was very lucky to be able to do. And it was, I think, one of the healthiest things I could do for myself, because I was able to step back enough and say, like, I don't need to just, like, as I wrote and as you said, turn every feeling I'm having into like, and now what I do with it, what's the action, what's the like, make meaning in that way. And so I tried to spend some time just disentangling, like, what is my identity and who am I outside of this career that has felt so important to me for so long, not just for the 2 years that I was an investigator, but like for so much of my life. I had done research and just, I cared about it. I was kind of like known to myself and known to my friends as someone so passionate about justice reform and specifically the death penalty. So, and trying to get to a place where I'm like, I can just exist without like that label attached or that like drive, was really valuable to me. And I started to go back to like, what are the things that brought me a lot of joy and that I just fell in love with when I was really young, and reading and writing were always really high up there for me. And so I decided, it was the beginning of COVID. I was like, I don't have really anyone else I need to be responsible for at this point in my life. This is like a good time to kind of take a career risk and try, if I'm ever going to try to like be a writer, this is a good time, like 25. And so I yeah, explore.
What was that something that you always wanted to do as as a kid? I mean, I know you said you saw the program on TV when you were, I think, 11, the death row
Mm-hmm.
inmate. So obviously, you did take that kind of path from childhood, but was there a passion also for writing around that age, or as you got into junior high and high school?
Yeah, I always had writing. I was a huge reader and still am, but like, was the kid who my mom was like yelling at me to stop reading with the lights off because it was gonna like hurt my eyes. Staying up late to read, very cool. Um, and writing.
Hey, that's way better than now with social
Right,
media,
I know.
right?
It's true, it's true.
Be like, stop reading so much. Oh my God,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
you have to tell a kid to
know.
stop
if,
reading.
if my future kids have that problem, I will be very happy.
Yeah, see, there we go.
But yeah, and then I always had writing as kind of like a side hobby. Like I wrote for the arts paper in college. I wrote in high school. I like always loved writing essays, which is so not many people love essays, but I not necessarily like English essays, but kind of like columns, like the essay that you found me through. So yes, it was a thread, but never something I considered seriously as like a full-time like project to devote myself to. I did after my dad died, I feel like I had these flickers of thoughts of like, okay, one day I'm going to write about this in some capacity. Like I just have to, but it was way too, as compared to the death row stuff where it's like, let me just dive in. Anytime I had
Yeah.
thoughts of like, I want to write about this, it was almost like a physical response where I felt like, no, this is too soon. I have not processed and felt enough to even be able to put words like cogently together in my own brain, let alone on paper. But once I had that space away from my old job and was going back to things that I loved, I was like, okay, I feel ready to at least dip my toes in trying to write.
And you started to write, so then how did the columns come along? Because you've been published in Slate and, like I said, Washington Post, Fortune,
Yes.
Huffington Post. So how did that come about when you were like, all right, I'm gonna start writing and then actually, have success and be published in some national publications?
Yeah, I was very much DIYing my writing career. I considered going to journalism school, but it's very expensive and a really hard industry. Then and now continues to be. So there was no guarantee of me getting like a full-time journalism job, even with a great like master's. So I thought I can use a lot less money to try to just learn as I go. And I practiced just by kind of writing like a blog about different issues that I cared about and kind of this essay journalism personal story form. And then I took a couple classes about pitching stories, and that's how I started getting published, is once I had felt like I'd practiced enough where I kind of like got a sense of where my writing was at, what kind of stories I wanted to tell. I just started pitching to different publications these ideas that I had, and my very first publication was a short essay about my dad coming out, but my first kind of like big national publication was in Wired about apps and technology that are designed to help people after they experience a death and dealing with all the logistics. So I relied on my personal experience to inspire. Like, I thought that was a disaster when my dad died, and I'm like, why am I getting phone calls from his car company about the lease payment 2 days later, and all of that logistical nightmare. So much of what I write, whether it includes my actual experience or not, is inspired by things that I've seen or experienced and see as like, this is a problem or this doesn't seem right, and then explore that as a journalist. And yeah, from there, I just started pitching more stories and combination of pitching ideas and submitting essays like the ones you read that are a little bit more personal and creative in nature. And as I've been doing that, I've also been writing a book, which is essentially a book version of the Washington Post essay, but it's really about my time as an investigator on death row, but kind of the frame story of the real second kind of meteor story of my dad's death and my experience and my process of investigating what happened to him, what happened to my family, who am I now, in that grief as I was investigating these cases. So that's been my big project.
And do you think that'll also help, with the grieving process for you, being able to write that book and then hopefully maybe helping others in their grieving and loss of their loved ones?
Yeah, absolutely. I get that question a lot about writing as a therapeutic and grieving process. And it's interesting because I don't think it is in the way that many would expect, at least for me. Like, I love writing, but I'm not a big journaler. I have to do a lot of processing in other ways before I'm ready to write about something. So by the time I'm writing something, I've made it through a few steps of processing, and feeling and grieving, etc. But what you touched on, which is very true for me, is there's something really powerful and healing about the way that I can connect with others and I hear from others. Like when something like that Watch Post piece comes out, I get a ton of emails from people either sharing their story or connecting in some way, and almost always being very kind and appreciative of my work, and that's really special. And I think the piece is about like not needing to make meaning, but what I'm doing now does actually feel very meaningful too. I think the difference is that I didn't start writing from the approach of I need to do something good and meaningful and powerful to kind of like combat this tragedy. It got to stand on its own, and I found meaning through it in a way that feels much more healthy and sustainable for me.
But also, like you just mentioned, and I didn't think of this, where people will email you when a piece like that is published, perhaps with their own story, their own grieving. They may not be great writers, but for you, that's your talent. And, you do have kind of that feedback from them that, hey, I understand what you're going through. I had the same kind of experience or similar experience. And, thank you for publishing that, because in a way it's like, hey, there's others out there, like me that have felt that pain and can kind of relate. And I think it probably does help others. You may not think so, but I think in the end it does, and that's probably why you get so much feedback from many times something like that's published.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think it's gotten so much better in recent years, but there is still so much stigma about mental illness and especially suicide deaths. And there's, inevitably when someone dies by suicide, I think at least one person, if not many more, have some kind of reaction that's like very blame heavy or very like, how selfish, how could they do that? So we still have like a long way to go. And I think a lot of people who specifically go through a suicide loss feel a unique type of pain from the complications and the stigma, and that's something a lot of people connect to when I write about that, because it can feel can feel like something very isolating.
Right. And I think that's important, for all ages. I was reading somewhere recently that I think the number 1 or 2 cause of death in college is death by suicide,
Yeah.
among young people. So, it's certainly something that should be talked about more so. And I think part of that too is the mental health aspect, like you said, that should be included in college and throughout life. I'm a proponent of therapy and all of that. So it's not just physical, but it's also mental in life. So one question I wanted to ask: so where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? Still writing, no podcasts, and
Good
TED
question.
Talks,
Yeah. Oh, I
all of
love
it, all the
that.
above. See,
All of the above. Yeah. In 5 years from now, I would love to have published this book. I think still writing. I would like to expand to other types of writing. I love doing journalism and essay and the book, but I see myself getting into some like script and screenplay writing, and yeah, just continuing. I think I'm a very curious, sometimes nosy person, which makes sense. I was an investigator, now I'm a writer, journalist, but it's such a fun job beyond all the like emotion, like the personal connection and beauty that I find in it and the way I get to connect with people. It's so exciting to me because it can change all the time. Like, I just get to be curious and follow that curiosity towards a story. And I learn from so many people as I interview them and do research for things I'm writing. So it's very exciting to me to think about what am I going to be writing about in 5 years, because I think there's lots of potential rabbit holes to go down in that time. But that's basically how I've gotten where I am, is like I was curious about this thing and then I dove into it, and that led me to a question about the next thing, and then it snowballs in a great way into like, oh, now I'm exploring something and learning about something and getting to shine light on something that maybe I didn't even know about right now. Maybe that's what I'll be doing in 5 years.
Yeah.
But yes, I hope to still be writing and specifically telling stories, shedding light on stories that are often forgotten or marginalized or just in some way not talked about, kind of cast in the shadows. I am grateful for the times where I get to shed a little light in those places.
Sure, sounds good. I mean, what do you like to do to unwind, or when you're not writing? Are there things you like doing, things that make you laugh, that kind of thing? Different from everything I think we've talked about, because I feel like we focus on so much like grief. It's like, yeah, you must laugh sometimes,
I
right?
know.
You have
I
to.
know. I'm always like, when I tell people what I do or what I write about, I'm like, I'm actually a really fun person. I promise. I'm pretty optimistic.
Well, when I reach out to you about the podcast, I'm like, well, this is kind of a fun podcast. I'm like, but you know what? You're a good writer. You're published nationally. I'm like, it would be it's very interesting, unique story. And I think for a lot of people will connect with it. So I think it's important. I think it's an important one to tell.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, I love fun though. Also fun. I do a lot of things. I think one of my favorite non-writing hobbies that has been really just like joyful and healthy for me, that I got into around the time that I started really committing to writing, was I got very into outdoors things, hiking and backpacking. And so I'll try to take at least a few backpacking trips a year, usually out west. But love that, love being in nature, love not having a phone that works and having everything I need with me on my back. Sometimes I have ideas while I'm out there, but mostly I'm just like blissed out on mountains and sunshine and water and whatever else is out in the world. So I love that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sophia, so much for doing this. I appreciate it. And best of luck to you and the rest of your amazing career. I can't wait to follow it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.